are very fortunate today to have as part of Duke's Rethinking Diplomacy program, Dr. William Colglazier, who is one of America's preeminent scientists, to address us on the challenges that are facing science and diplomacy today. Dr. Colglazier has many accomplishments. Two of those that are most important to us today, I think, is that he is the editor-in-chief of the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, a journal of science and diplomacy, and the leadership that he provided from 2011 to 2014 as the Science and Technology Advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton under President Barack Obama. Duke's rethinking of diplomacy focuses on what we call anticipatory diplomacy, the urgent need to look beyond today to globally evaluate and to shape the policy choices of tomorrow. In our ever-shrinking world and with growing crises, we simply cannot afford to wait until a crisis occurs before we respond. Diplomacy requires science to develop pragmatic and effective options, and science requires diplomacy to become governing doctrine and policy. So we must, as a nation and global community, anticipate and shape our future choices. It isn't possible to think of a major issue today in any aspect of human existence without recognizing how important the role of science and technology has become and will be for the foreseeable future. The need to use science to create and maintain a safe, sustainable tomorrow for humankind has never been more clear. Today, Dr. Colglazier will share his thoughts about the major challenges and opportunities that science diplomacy faces for its future. We're delighted to have you with us, Doctor, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bob and Giovanni. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. First of all, I should say I'm giving you my own personal views, so don't hold the AAAS responsible for what I'm going to say. In my career, I really started out as a theoretical physicist, and I was a professor, but over more than now 30 years, I've been sort of involved in sort of the interface of science and technology with public policy, international affairs, and diplomacy. And using what a name that's become popular, science diplomacy, although sciences have been involved for many decades with these issues. What I thought I'd start with, the world is very different now from what it was a decade ago when I was in the State Department. I tried to list what are the things going on now that are different and were challenges for us, and both on the political level as well as on the scientific level. And so I came up with 16 of them. You're all familiar with them, of course, the pandemic, the competition between the US and China, the invasion of Ukraine, now this alliance between Russia, China, and Iran, all the arms control agreements with Russia now pretty much lapsed, the current Middle East war, the economic stresses, deglobalization and fraying supply chains. Now we have autocratic leaders even in democracies. The developing world is trying to navigate this multipolar world which we're in. The challenge, the misery of people, that uncontrolled migration, and also the political challenges that creates. Now the lack of progress because of all these events on trying to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals as part of the UN 2030 agenda. Climate change coming even faster than the scientists once believed. And now all these emerging technology threats, you're familiar with the list, from artificial intelligence, synthetic biology on down the list. In the US, everyone is focused on the 2024 election and what that's going to mean for the world, and the concern about losing faith in democracy. And also, sort of somewhat sense, losing faith in science technology being seen as tools to help make the world a better place. So let me tell you what I mean by science diplomacy. I'm not fond of trying to make it into an academic discipline, so it's kind of a simple-minded definition that I'll give here. I sort of see it as science, scientific information, scientists, scientific engagement, helping to advance the diplomatic goals. And diplomats, as we all know, are interested in national interest, although national interest often overlaps with global interest. And so the scientists may undertake a sort of science helping diplomacy with their scientists' own view of what diplomatic goals would be useful, but can also be the real diplomats who think that science and technology engagement can actually be a tool for what they're trying to accomplish. But it also works the other way around. Diplomacy helping to advance the national and the global science and technology enterprise. The scientists are certainly interested in that. There are lots of obstacles sometimes to international scientific collaboration from visas and from other constraints. So they need the help of the real diplomats to sometimes overcome some of these hurdles. The diplomatic people can actually, in this case, think it's in their interest, in the national interest, to also help advance the national and the global scientific enterprise. But the one thing about science diplomacy, to me, that I think is somewhat unique. So we know science and technology innovation moving incredibly fast these days, and sometimes it can create new pathways that can overcome some of the hurdles that have been making it very difficult for the diplomats to resolve problems. And creating those new pathways, in some sense, you might say, is science and technology and innovation somehow leapfrogging over some of the diplomatic challenges to create paths that can actually help move things forward. So let me mention what are sort of the science diplomacy's track record over it really took off after World War II. In fact, the U.S. government was interested back then in science diplomacy, primarily for intelligence reasons, finding out what was going on in other countries, what their scientists were doing, and how scientists influenced other countries. But if I had to list things that I think have been successes of science diplomacy over the last couple decades, a number of which are being actually are no longer successes in the sense that there have been giant dramatic setbacks. The U.S.-China Science and Technology Agreement, the first one in 1979, right after ping-pong diplomacy, renewed every 5 years. And now, as you know, with the current renewal has been put up for a renegotiation with 1 year up until March of this year, I believe, and trying to decide whether the two countries will continue the Science and Technology Agreement. The famous Montreal Protocol in 1987 is due not only to the scientists who won the Nobel Prize, finding out the challenges from refrigerants, chlorofluorocarbons, but also the companies that make refrigerants finding there were alternatives, and it was in their interest also to agree with the Montreal Protocol, although they disagreed with it originally, but then it also required really talented diplomats in the United States and Europe and elsewhere who actually came up with the worldwide treaty. The nuclear arms control agreements in the 1990s, many of those came about through back-channel discussions to begin with between scientists in the U.S. and the Soviet Union in China, and the agreements with Russia really came about in part because the scientists that in these non-governmental track 2 discussions that U.S. scientists are engaging with turned out to be Gorbachev's key advisors. And so that actually helped make the way for some of the agreements at that time. They have Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has influenced the progress that resulted in the Paris Climate Agreement and the annual Conference of Parties. Unique aspect of that actually is the summary for policymakers, which is negotiated between scientists and the scientific community. The Iran nuclear agreement, of course, which was ended in the Trump administration, and also the scientists, the diplomats of the United Nations in developing the UN 2030 agenda. They knew that science, technology, innovation were important to make progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, but they didn't know how to do it. And so they created a part of the 2030 agenda called a Technology Facilitation Mechanism to do a better job of harnessing science and technology. But as all those setbacks I listed, politics remains a more powerful force than science, and as current events and these setbacks make absolutely clear. And now the security challenges, in part stimulated by the competition between the U.S. and China and behavior of the Chinese government in terms of stealing technologies and spying, sometimes through scientific collaboration, means that there's a lot more concern by the U.S. government and other Western governments that there should be more controls over what types of collaboration could occur with the autocratic countries, and that very well likely may slow down the worldwide advance of science. But we should remember that these current tensions don't obscure the fact that one way to influence other countries and learn about their advances in science and technology is through engagement with their scientific communities. Well, I wanted to just go very briefly through some of the aspects of my background to show you how I got involved from being a theoretical physicist into this interface between science and diplomacy and international affairs. You can do that with pictures of several people who I consider great science diplomats. The first one, George Brown, he was a congressman from Southern California. I was in an early class of the AAAS Science and Technology Fellowship Program. Then it was, I think, only 8 or 9 people total, and it was only with the Congress I worked for George Brown. He had a number of contributions in terms of international collaboration between the U.S. and after the collapse of between the U.S. and Mexico, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So he was, in some sense, a science diplomat, although he wasn't a scientist. Then I've been very lucky and fortunate to have some wonderful mentors of my career who were also great science diplomats, although they never served in government. In this picture right here, Paul Doty, a world-class biochemist at Harvard, created the Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard, where I worked for him. And Pete Panofsky directed the Stanford Lunar Accelerator Center. I worked for Pete as well. Both of them were the two of the scientists who were involved with the Russians and the Chinese scientists in talking about how to prevent nuclear weapons from being used again. Sherry Rowland, one of the 3 scientists that got the Nobel Prize for alerting the world to the chlorofluorocarbon issue. He was in charge of foreign affairs at the U.S. National Academy of Sciences when I spent 20 years. Well, he spent for part of the time that I was there for a longer period of time. I would accompany Sherry to a number of places, including to Iran. And Millie Dresselhaus, sort of known as the Queen of Carbon, a professor at MIT. She used her great reputation trying to help women in a range of countries around the world who were in scientific careers, overcoming the hurdles that they face. Millie actually did serve in government. She was in the Department of Energy, head of the Office of Science at a period, but most of her career she was, like the others, working solely from the scientific side. And lastly, I want to mention Glenn Schweitzer, who was one of my colleagues when I went on a sabbatical to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences in 1991. He was a scientist and a diplomat. He worked on nuclear disarmament, international science. He served for the U.S. State Department in Yugoslavia and Russia. He was head of the Science and Technology Center in Moscow after the end of the Cold War. And at the U.S. National Academies, he was the main professional staff member for dealing with Iran, for dealing with Russia and the other states of the former Soviet Union, even to some extent in the Middle East. He passed away this year, a little over, I think it was 91, but he was working up until the very end, another great science diplomat. Then I just want to show the covers of some of the, as I said, I went in 1991 on a sabbatical to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and Engineering and Medicine to head the international programs. And there we had a very active program engaging with a number of countries around the world. And I just have some of the book covers of studies and work that illustrate the kind of things that were done. A lot that was done with Russia, like this right here, on cooperation on nuclear non-proliferation. A number with Chinese Academy of Sciences. We had an office actually in Beijing after the renormalization of relations. This one was on urban air pollution issues. In the Middle East in the 1990s, after Oslo, a very active program working with Palestinian, Israeli, and Jordanian scientists on common research issues. This one dealing with water issues in the Middle East. Funded by the Gates Foundation, a 10-year initiative working with the science academies in Africa and helping them become more important advisors to their own governments. With Iran, actually for almost 20 years, beginning in the early 2000s, encouragement of both governments, even though the governments did not get along, they wanted their science communities to engage, and it was through their academies of sciences. So we had, not on the nuclear issues, but working on public health issues, on environmental issues, on a wide range of topics. And this is one of the reports that came out of a meeting that we had in Iran. I also wanted to show a study that I thought was quite interesting and insightful that was done at the request of the U.S. intelligence agencies in about 2005. What they wanted to know was that a number of countries are making very ambitious plans for how to capitalize on science and technology. And what they asked the national academies to do with a committee that could actually give them advice on what were the factors that might determine which countries are most successful in achieving their goals. And so it was a very knowledgeable committee, expertise in a number of areas, looked at a lot of concrete data, publications, patents, et cetera. But the one factor they came up with in the end that probably had more to do with any other, to what extent a country might be successful in achieving its very ambitious goals, had to deal with the culture of the country more than any other single factor, which I thought was quite interesting. A lot of studies done in this period, particularly after 9/11, on science and security issues, as you might expect. In fact, one of the reports at that time led to actually the government creating the Department of Homeland Security. Then I wanted to highlight just two more, who were my favorites because they actually had a big impact on my career after I retired from the National Academies in 2011. Most of the time I was there actually as the executive officer helping the president to oversee the studies, about 200 plus studies done a year on topics. Two studies I'm showing right here, both of them are actually not funded by the government. They're actually funded by private individuals. This first one, Our Common Journey, a transition towards sustainability. What it was to look at what are the, how can science and technology and innovation help make progress towards sustainable development? And those of you who are familiar with sustainable development, the common definition of sustainable development came from a report done by the UN in the 1980s called the Brundtland Report that was called Our Common Future. Our Common Journey was sort of a play on words from Our Common Future. And what the journey meant to indicate was, in order to make progress on sustainable development, it really is a journey of involvement between the governance sector, between civil society, between the science and technology community, with business, learning by doing, making progress as you go along, seeing what works and doesn't work, and making corrections, and actually required to undertake it at all levels. And the second report, again, like I said, not funded by the government, but funded by a private individual. In fact, it was the same individual that helped fund anonymously the creation of the Science and Technology Policy Fellowship Program of the AAAS. This is called The Pervasive Role of Science, Technology, and Health in Foreign Policy, Imperatives for the Department of State. The view that in the current world, the State Department has to up its game to have more people that are conversant in and expert in issues of science and technology. The diplomats need to be aware of that. It was also a tool we talked about in terms of that can be used for diplomacy. Although it was not requested by the Department of State, Madeleine Albright was the secretary at the time, and she paid attention not to all the recommendations in the report, but especially to one of them, was the creation of the position of the Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State, creating it as a non-political fixed-term position of 3 years. And after I retired from the National Academies in 2011, I was asked to be the Science and Technology Advisor, both under Clinton and under Kerry from 2011 to 2014. Just one fact from the time that I spent in the State Department, what now seems almost like a golden era as I look back on it, with how the world has changed over the last 10 plus years. Since then, I engaged with a large number of countries, and the interesting thing for me was every country I engaged with, not only their scientific people, but with their government officials, was the first topic that everyone wanted to talk about, at least with me, was how science technology can stimulate innovation and economic development in this globalized, competitive, interconnected world. So as with a rich country, a poor country, a developed country, or just an emerging country, all of them were very much focused on this. They saw it was absolutely essential. They were all trying to make ambitious plans to up their game, and they saw this was essential for prosperity, security, and competitiveness in the world today. And they're very willing to undertake policies and investments to build their country into an innovative nation. And they wanted to collaborate on science, technology, innovation with the most technologically advanced countries in the world, which for the US was a great asset. for U.S. diplomacy at the time. So I had a lot of fun during this period, in part because of there were challenges, of course, but this issue in particular, I enjoyed very much engaging with a wide variety of countries at all levels of development. After I retired in 2014 from the State Department, because I had gotten involved during the period when the discussions were going on about the creation of the 2030 Agenda at the UN and the Sustainable Development Goals. But in part because of that report, Our Common Future, that I indicated when I was at the National Academies, I was asked to serve on several expert committees that were looking at how they could do a better job harnessing science and technology. And because of that, I got appointed to a 10-person advisory committee as part of the 2030 Agenda. The UN created something with an interesting name, the Technology Facilitation Mechanism. How could technology be facilitated to help achieve the sustainable development, and several aspects of the TFM, but one of which was this 10-person group of advisors who are non-governmental. 5 reflect the UN, 5 from developed countries, 5 developing countries, 5 men, 5 women, but all wonderful, very wise and interesting people. And I was the co-chair from 2016 to 2018. I'm still involved to some extent with this effort at the United Nations. The great challenge for the aspirational rhetoric at the UN on the 2030 Agenda is great, but the real challenge is actually turning the aspirational rhetoric into real action plans. And one of the things that we developed have the name of STI for SDGs roadmaps. Roadmaps comes from the technology sector. Every country has national goals, and they have plans for that. A number of them have goals for building their capacity in science and technology. And many of these countries are also building plans on which of the sustainable development goals are important to them. And STI, SDG roadmaps was the intersection of those 3 national plans, but actually trying to turn them into real action plans, learning by doing, making corrections, involvement with the science community. And so international agencies created a work group on roadmaps, and through that development of a guidebook for countries that were interested in trying to do this. And developing these roadmaps was supposed to be an all-of-society type event. It wasn't just governments doing it from top down. It was a challenge in itself to do that, to involve with all sectors of society. But pilot countries were encouraged, and a number of international agencies and countries agreed to help fund pilot countries who were attempting to develop these plans. Much to my regret, the US was not one of the funders, but included Japan, the EU, and a number of UN agencies provided funding and help. The guidebook was released. It's well worth reading. It's available on the UN website. And the number of pilot countries expanded to 6, although there are a number of other countries that are interested in actually joining this. 3 in Africa, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Kenya, and 3 others, India, Serbia, and Ukraine. Although there's a real lesson in this too. As I'm sure you all realize, the best laid plans trying to make progress on sustainable development, the thing that can interrupt us more than anything else are conflicts and wars. And of course, we have the Russian invasion of Ukraine, all of the still efforts in Ukraine talking about their STI for SDG roadmaps, and then in Ethiopia, the civil war in Ethiopia that occurred. So again, this is actually, as I saw the UN Secretary General said this morning, in terms of his priorities for 2024, that peace, P-E-A-C-E, is the missing piece, P-I-E-C-E, that we have to do. And of course, one of the SDGs actually refers to the peace. Just one last thing on sustainable development, trying to create action plans and roadmaps. In 2022, with colleague Sherry Murray, we were asked to co-chair a committee that on a report on operationalizing sustainable development. Operationalizing is going back to creating action plans and roadmaps. But what we did in this case was look at the subnational level of things that actually have occurred, either at universities, cities, private civil society, private sector, which are actually making real progress to show things can be accomplished in moving towards sustainable development, even though we had these tremendous setbacks occurring elsewhere. So let me turn now to what is, I guess, the real messages in my reports. first of all, just to go back for a second, the disruptions and the threats and opportunities of emerging technologies. Even a decade ago, for example, as part of the technology facilitation mechanism at the UN, which is a meeting held every year in New York, a multi-stakeholder forum, which is not only the diplomats, but people from other governments, from the private sector, from civil society, from the science and tech community, talking about these issues of the role of science and technology to facilitate the SDGs. And a major topic at every one of these, even back over a decade ago, was, again, the challenges coming from the threats, disruptions, as well as the opportunities of emerging technology. So it's an issue that's been with us for a while. But as we all know, no one can predict the future, and unfortunately, scientists aren't any better at doing that than anyone else. But it's still useful, I think, to go through foresight exercises. So when I was in the State Department, I was involved with the U.S. intelligence agencies to some extent, sort of thinking about, at least for science and technology, what we could say about possibilities emerging in the future that are coming from the rapid advance in science and technology. To show you, our foresight didn't always lead us to actually figure out what exactly was going to happen. Just the case of social media, we did not realize the extent to which social media would be a disruptive force when we were talking about it a decade ago, trying to figure out how things might evolve. So it is challenging but it's worthwhile to expand your thinking to do these foresight exercises. But one very interesting one, which some of the students here particularly may not have seen it. Every 4 years, the director of the National Intelligence, U.S. intelligence agencies produce a report called the Global Trend Series. It's actually done at the end of one administration, and it's actually used to brief the incoming president of the next administration. And there is an unclassified part of this report that is released. The most recent one after the last election was the Global Trends 2040, and it's interesting reading, particularly going back to the earlier ones and see what has changed in terms of predictions. I guess one thing that is a significant factor is that in terms of the pace of change, things often occur even faster than they were thinking about when these reports were written. Of course, now they're in process of trying to do the next one, which is going to be presented to the next president. So you can just imagine what the challenges are depending on which president it turns out to be after the 2024 elections. I just listed an article where I wrote about this whole foresight exercise back in 2018. It's interesting for me to look back and see how my own views, the extent to which I laid out various scenarios to which ones actually were realized. Back in 2019, I was asked to give the keynote address at something called the World Science Forum. That year it was in Budapest, Hungary, on science diplomacy. And I came up at the end with sort of 5 areas that I thought were important for focus on science diplomacy back then. One was controlling the technologies of war, particularly nuclear weapons still, but now there are many others, cyber, hypersonic weapons, et cetera. Providing foresight and facilitating dialogue on these rapid science and technology developments, the opportunities and the challenges. Maintaining a channel of communication between estranged nations where there is the potential for conflict or war that might be eased, maintaining a channel of communication at least through scientific engagement. Accelerating progress on the global goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, working with developing countries in particular. Building science, technology, innovation capacity in emerging economies to help them achieve their own goals. So now it's 5 years later. So with all of this makes me even more humble every time I do this. So now trying to come up with what would I say, or what are the priorities in this case for the United States in terms of science diplomacy, in my view, over the next 5 years. And I came up with 10 of them. And it's sort of almost in the order of which importance, anyway, in my view, for sort of focus. And it's interesting, the first two. First, it's actually the U.S. needs to return to what has been its game plan for how it's become the world leader in science and technology around the world. That's been our main asset. And in terms of being able to attract bright people from other countries who come, although a number go back home and help their own countries, a number stay here, become U.S. citizens and contribute here, both in government and private sector and university professors. It's one of the best talent recruitment programs in the world, what the U.S. has done, attracting talent, smart people from around the world. And often, and very key to that is being able to, at least for fundamental research, sometimes called basic research, that's research that's conducted openly, it's published in the open literature, and it's open to international scientific collaboration. And that's in part what attracted many people to the United States. Now, with the security concerns, there's much more concern about international collaboration, particularly with certain countries like China. And there may be more hurdles that are put in place of maintaining that international scientific collaboration, when I believe it's in the U.S. interest to maintain with China, among other countries. It's one way we learn about first of all, they have very bright people. We actually help to train a lot of them, and they're coming with innovations and advances that we may not be aware of or not engage with them. It also is a window on the thinking, not only of their scientific community, but also into their government. And it's one way, at least, to influence their scientific communities. Back in the Reagan administration, there was this NSDD 189, National Security Decision Directive 189, which is sort of been the blueprint for fundamental research. Should be open only to the extent that it's classified. Now there's concern about creation of more areas of what's called controlled but unclassified information. There's always been a few dealing with infectious diseases, the ITAR regulations, and so on, but the fear that it will increase and make it more difficult to maintain international collaboration in fundamental research. In terms of expanding the second one, they're expanding America's funding for this area. You know, the CHIPS and Science Act passed, funding was provided for the CHIPS, but it was only no appropriation for the science part, and so that's been hung up. So to me, if the U.S. is going to return to its game plan that made it the world leader in science and technology, it has to go back and do the things that I listed in the first two bullets. Then it's also really important, even with the competition and conflict, in my view, with China, to maintain dialogue, at least among the leaders of the scientific communities in the two countries. That's occurred for a long time, still occurring to some extent. The National Academy of Sciences is doing it. Professional societies like the American Physical Society is doing it. The APS, to some extent, and also thinking about it, how it can do more. So I think it's very important, at least, to help maybe both countries can influence their governments, both scientific communities can influence their governments, but also them to understand exactly the issues that they both have to face in terms of particularly international collaboration in this era. One positive thing that's come out of the current challenges right now is the U.S. government's much more interested now in increasing collaboration with America's democratic allies. That's South Korea, the Republic of Korea, with Japan, with Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, the EU, engaging not only in fundamental science, but also engaging in these emerging technologies, as well as engaging in what I would call science and security dialogue, so they both understand how they're dealing with some of the security challenges that occur. So that's positive. Then it's actually been, in part, largely through the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, helping the Ukrainian scientific community to survive and rebuild as they reform, and also to strengthen Ukrainian science as they deal with this in this terrible conflict that they're in. The U.S. National Academy of Sciences has raised a fair amount of money, actually. First of all, it was to help those scientists who could leave during the war effort, which were mainly women at that time, to get temporary jobs in Poland and elsewhere, but now actually helping to fund scientists in Ukraine right now. For the here are the last five, which actually go back a little bit to some of the things I had back in 2019. Encourage more collaboration in science and capacity building with developing countries, including those STI for SDG roadmaps. Also, one thing that was created back a decade ago was, since there were, after the U.S. appointed a science advisor in its foreign ministry, that began to catch on with a number of countries, and an informal network called FEMSTAN, Foreign Ministries Science and Technology Advice Network, of the people in foreign ministries that held these type positions. And that's still quite active, so it's very useful way to find out the thinking of other countries, at least for the people that hold the science and technology portfolios in foreign ministries. Again, in terms of one important area, going back to the issue, how can science and technology advances leap over diplomatic hurdles? That means that U.S. research and development focusing even more on innovations from science and technology that can address our challenges in climate change, pandemics, and the many other global concerns that we faced. When I was doing that article about trying foresight thinking, there was one article I read was trying to make the case that artificial intelligence could actually be a key ingredient in trying to deal with how we address climate change. I thought that was a little far-fetched at the time. I've become much more a believer now that it's one of the things that we need to harness more effectively. Because what we really know is that the climate change is occurring even faster. Engage with scientific communities worldwide on how to better advise their own governments and societies, and as well as better challenge misinformation and unscientific views. There was another informal network that was created a decade ago called INGSA, the International Network of Government Science Advice. And actually, they have now a global meeting as well as meetings regionally, and it's with groups, both governmental and non-governmental, are interested in trying to strengthen the sort of the science advice mechanism in countries. Again, harping on the same thing again, accelerate the efforts, at least of the science community itself, not only advising governments, but working itself on how to mitigate the threats and realize the benefits of emerging technologies. And still, although now it's extremely complicated, but at least explore when feasible avenues to create dialogues with the scientific communities in countries where the conflicts and wars now exist. I mentioned Glenn Schweitzer, the great science diplomat who passed away this year. He was in the middle of exploring exactly those with both Iran and with Russia. There'll probably be a number of, probably quite a while before anything significant can emerge from that as things develop, maybe even longer with the conflicts in the Middle East. So, and then this is my last slide. So just a kind of an obvious comment that science alone can't solve our problem, but only people can do that. But I do believe science diplomacy can help. But it does require remembering that science diplomacy, in my view, really got to start after World War II in the next several decades with non-governmental scientists trying to reduce the threat of nuclear weapons. I imagine most of you have seen the Oppenheimer movie now, but that challenge of dealing with an existential threat for humanity with nuclear weapons. So that priority obviously must continue. But again, to make every country a knowledge-based society where scientific knowledge can be an important input to public policy is not a guarantee for more rational policies of the government and societies, but hopefully it can help to enable countries to realize the benefits and manage the risks of this rapid change in science and technology, as well as to help operationalize sustainable development at all levels, from the global down to the local. But then lastly, that I put down here, now that I look at what's happening right now, the two most powerful forces, in my view, that can affect the future of humanity, even in an existential way, and they operate at very different time frames. One, of course, is national and international politics, particularly with increasing competition, conflicts, and wars. And then this rapidly accelerating, unpredictable scientific and technological revolution. You know, when you talk about at different speeds or time frames, normally what people talk about in terms of politicians want answers very fast, and scientists are obviously slow because they don't have all of the knowledge and their uncertainties, and they want to conduct more research about this. So the view about the different time frames between politics and science has often been that science moves incredibly slowly, and political side wants answers right now. That's really what's important. Now it's almost flipped on its head as you look perhaps what may be the more significant factor in the different time frames. It's obviously taking us a long time, particularly at the international level, to come up with ways to actually deal with these rapid changes that are occurring in science and technology. And yet at the same time, science and technology is moving ever faster with these threats and potential opportunities. So we have these two very different time frames, which makes it even more challenging to deal with. I think the last thing I was going to show for anyone that's interested, the AAAS has this little online journal called Science and Diplomacy, and we try to cover some of these issues. I listed some of the things that I've written over the years. And there's also an article I wrote recently dealing with this whole issue of science and security that was in Issues in Science and Technology. So thank you, Bob. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Bill. That was really fascinating, and especially taking us over time to see what things have happened and what things have changed and what tomorrow looks like. And I'll try to ask a short question so our students can get their questions in as well. What diplomats are concerned with is how to translate uncertainty into action that is effective. And the last Global Trends report said that our resources, meaning American resources, are insufficient to deal with our threats. So Duke, for that reason, and among others, focuses on trying to articulate what tomorrow will bring with some degree of structure, I will have to say, and to put it into the public arena so that communities can begin to discuss these issues before they become crises. So if this looks like a Rubik cube to you, could you suggest what avenues might be best to pursue those goals?
Well, I think that sort of fits in with what I was talking about, foresight activities. It's trying to do exactly that sort of thing. So I think it's very worthwhile that Duke is undertaking it. One of the challenges I'm sure you're well aware of, it requires, we're often quite wedded to our own views of what, at least in my case, what should be done or what could be done, and not quite open enough to thinking of alternative scenarios. Plus also what are the kind of trends that are occurring around the world and what things might move more quickly that you anticipate. I know what the global trends exercise, one thing that they learned, at least back in the days when I was in the State Department, was actually having a dialogue with people in the same jobs in other countries, talking about how they view the possibilities of the way things are going to evolve in the world as a way to sort of expand one's thinking. I don't know to what extent you might do that with Duke. Actually having dialogues with university people in a number of other countries about how they're approaching these kind of foresight and thinking, both for their own countries, but also how that can be useful for the U.S. But anyway, I think it's very useful that you all are doing that, trying to help alert the public, the government about ways things that could evolve in the future and how we have to be better prepared to deal with them.